It was the dead of winter, 1963. Snow covered Kenosha, a small Wisconsin city pressed against the edge of Lake Michigan. The air was thick, the kind that bites through a man's coat and lingers in his bones. Anthony Biernat was a familiar face in town, 46 years old, clean-cut, the owner of the Lakeside Music Company. He made his living the old-fashioned way, collecting coins from the 85 jukeboxes he owned across Kenosha and Racine counties, and even a few in the Navy's Great Lakes Training Center down in Illinois. To most, he was a respectable businessman. To others, a man with quiet connections that stretched back decades. On the evening of January 7th, Biernat pulled into the parking lot of the North Shoreline Railroad station right by the frozen waterfront. Witnesses later said they saw 3 men waiting in a Ford sedan. Within moments, they forced Biernat into the car and sped off into the darkness. The snow swallowed their tracks before the police could even start asking questions. That night, Anthony Biernat vanished without a trace. No phone calls, no ransom note, no sign of a struggle beyond what a few frightened bystanders had seen. For weeks, Kenosha County deputies and the FBI combed the countryside, fighting the cold and the silence that followed him. Whatever business Anthony Biernat had refused, whoever he'd crossed, they made sure of one thing: he wasn't coming home. 3 weeks after Anthony Biernat vanished, the snow was still thick across Kenosha County. The search had turned cold like the fields that stretched empty toward the Illinois line. Then, near the end of January, a strange call came in to the Milwaukee police. The voice on the other end claimed to know where Biernat could be found. "If you want to find Biernat's body," the caller said, "look in the basement of an empty house in an abandoned area in Kenosha County." When the officer pressed for details, the man gave a chilling reply. "You can be sure of one thing: it ain't going to fly away." Sheriff's deputies took the words literally. The phrase "ain't going to fly away" led them toward the deserted Bong Air Force Base, a half-finished military site abandoned years earlier. On January the 28th, 1963, they followed a dirt road to a forgotten farmhouse about 20 miles outside the city. In the basement, half buried under frozen earth and a layer of lime, they found him. Anthony Biernat, still wearing his wristwatch, stopped at 12:20 a.m. His hands and feet were tied. The coroner later said he'd been struck 3 or 4 times in the back of the head with a sharp instrument. Whoever killed him had tried to speed up decomposition with lime, but the bitter cold preserved everything. The jukebox man from Kenosha hadn't run away, hadn't skipped town. He'd been buried in a shallow grave beneath a vacant house, his death sealed in silence by the winter ground. Before his name was linked to a murder file, Anthony Biernat was known as a man who made music pay. His company, Lakeside Music, ran more than 85 jukeboxes across taverns, bowling alleys and cocktail lounges in Kenosha and Racine counties. He even had machines spinning records at the Great Lakes Naval Training Center down in Illinois, a steady source of cash from sailors looking for a song and a drink. Every week, Biernat made the rounds, collecting coins from the chrome machines that lit up the night in small-town bars. By 1962, his business ranked 6th in revenue among a dozen jukebox operators in the county. He'd built it from the ground up, starting back in the 1930s when he serviced illegal slot machines for Chicago mobsters in northern Illinois. To most, he was a self-made man, a symbol of post-war hustle and small-town success. But in the shadows, his roots crossed into the mob's old territory. Chicago's outfit had long considered jukeboxes their domain, and word spread that Biernat's independence had started to bother the wrong people. Lakeside Music wasn't just a business, it was a territory. And in that world, territory meant power, and power had a price. By the early 1960s, organized crime had its eyes on everything that made money between Chicago and Milwaukee, jukeboxes included. The outfit controlled the routes in northern Illinois, while the Milwaukee Mafia handled the Wisconsin side. But one man, Anthony Biernat, ran his Lakeside Music Company without paying tribute to either family. To the mob, that kind of independence wasn't courage, it was defiance. And defiance had consequences. FBI sources later said the Chicago outfit wanted a share of Biernat's profits, especially from his machines at the Great Lakes Naval Training Center, a lucrative military account. When Biernat refused to partner up, Chicago bosses allegedly sent word north, asking Milwaukee's boss, Frank Balistrieri, to handle it. Balistrieri, known as Mr. Big, had been running the Milwaukee family since 1961. He was sharp, ruthless, and eager to prove his value to the syndicate. His men were already leaning on local bookmakers and small businesses, pushing for a piece of anything that brought in cash. Biernat, with his wide route and steady income, became the next target. The message was simple: either share your take or lose your business. But Biernat didn't scare easily. He'd built his empire alone and planned to keep it that way. That decision, in the world he operated in, signed his death warrant. The investigation into Anthony Biernat's disappearance had gone nowhere for weeks. The sheriff's office had followed every lead, but the snow, the silence, and the fear that followed the case made progress impossible. Then, one January night, a phone call broke the stillness. Milwaukee police answered. The voice on the line was calm, steady. The kind of voice that didn't bluff. The caller said he knew where to find Biernat. Look in the basement of an empty house in an abandoned area in Kenosha County, he told the officer. When pressed for a clearer location, the man gave a cryptic answer. You can be sure of one thing, it ain't gonna fly away. Then he hung up. The phrase stuck with investigators. Ain't gonna fly away. It sounded like a clue. Maybe even a joke. Kenosha County deputies thought it might point to the old Bong Air Force Base, a massive construction project that had been started in the 1950s and abandoned before completion. The government had cleared out the area years earlier, leaving behind empty land, boarded-up homes, and a scattering of forgotten farmhouses. Deputies bundled up and headed into the frozen countryside, combing through the deserted properties around the base. On January 28, 1963, their search led them to one of those farmhouses, silent, isolated, and half buried in snow. What they found in its basement would end the search, but open a much darker chapter in the story. The old farmhouse sat alone in the wind, its windows boarded, its roof sagging under the weight of snow. Inside, the air was still and heavy with the smell of decay. Down in the basement, sheriff's deputies found what they'd come for and what they'd feared. In the frozen dirt lay the body of Anthony Biernat. He was bound hand and foot, half buried in a shallow grave and dusted with lime. Whoever put him there thought the chemical would eat away the evidence. But the winter had other plans. The cold had preserved everything. Biernat still wore his wristwatch. It had stopped at 12:20 a.m., giving investigators a rough time of death. The coroner later reported that he'd been struck 3 or 4 times in the back of the head with a sharp, heavy object, blows so hard they crushed his skull. The scene told a story of panic and violence. There were signs he'd fought back, signs the killers had worked fast and left faster. They'd covered him with a piece of canvas, scattered the lime, and walked away. What began as a missing persons case had turned into a murder investigation, one that reached far beyond that lonely farmhouse. The snow-covered ground in Kenosha County now held the body of a man who had crossed the line between business and organized crime. When Anthony Biernat's body was pulled from that farmhouse basement, the case shifted from a local mystery to a full-scale investigation. Kenosha County deputies knew they were in over their heads. The clues pointed toward organized crime, and Wisconsin's small-town lawmen didn't have the resources to take on the mob. Governor John Reynolds made it official. He called on the FBI to join the probe, admitting the state was relatively helpless in combating organized crime. The Bureau moved in fast, hoping Biernat's abduction near the Illinois border might qualify as a federal kidnapping case. If the killers had crossed state lines, it gave them jurisdiction and a reason to dig deeper. Agents combed through Biernat's business records, questioned other jukebox operators, and traced every lead tied to Chicago, and Milwaukee. None of the 11 other route owners reported mob pressure, at least not openly. The witnesses who saw the abduction couldn't identify a single suspect. The killers had moved like ghosts, quick, deliberate, and silent. Rumors spread that the Milwaukee Mafia had carried out the hit on orders from the Chicago outfit. Both families denied involvement. Still, word on the street was clear. Biernat had refused to cut the mob in, and that refusal had sealed his fate. By spring, the trail had gone cold. The FBI packed up its field notes and moved on to other cases. The deputies stayed behind, staring at an empty farmhouse and a long list of unanswered questions. Biernat's funeral drew 1,000 mourners, but none could say who killed him or why justice had been buried under the snow along with his body. 5 years after Anthony Biernat's murder, a dying mobster in Kansas City started talking. His name was Joseph Joey G. Guerrera, a known enforcer with ties to both the Milwaukee and Kansas City crime families. Before a heart attack took him in 1968, Guerrera confessed to investigators that he had helped kidnap and kill Biernat. According to Guerrera, the job hadn't been meant as a murder. Milwaukee's boss, Frank Balistrieri, had ordered Guerrera and 2 others to work over Biernat, rough him up, scare him, make him agree to do business with the Milwaukee family. But things went bad fast. Biernat fought back in the basement, hitting one of his captors hard enough to draw blood. In the panic that followed, one of the men struck Biernat in the head with a gun butt. The blows killed him. The grave, Guerrera said, had already been dug, meant for a Milwaukee bookie who'd once refused to pay the mob his cut. Biernat became the replacement. When the killing brought in the FBI, the Milwaukee Mafia started covering their tracks. A low-level soldier was ordered to leak a tip about the body, feeding police just enough information to make it look like the Chicago outfit was behind it. The goal was to get the feds out of Wisconsin by turning it into a local murder case. It worked. The FBI dropped the federal angle and the Milwaukee crew walked clean. By the time Guerrera spoke up, most of the men involved were long gone, or out of reach. His confession didn't bring charges, only clarity. A glimpse into how one business dispute between a jukebox man and the mob turned into a killing nobody was ever meant to solve. More than 20 years after Anthony Biernat's murder, the case resurfaced in a place no one expected, the basement of a Milwaukee condominium. It was November 30th, 1984, when more than 100 law enforcement officers swarmed the building. Among them were 50 FBI agents and 11 IRS investigators. Their target was a major cocaine and extortion ring tied to the Milwaukee Mafia. At the center of it was Anthony "Tony Pipe" Pipito, a longtime soldier under Frank Balistrieri. When agents searched his storage locker, they found over 2 kilograms of cocaine and records showing profits of more than $1 million that year alone. But buried in the evidence was something even more disturbing, a story Pipito couldn't stop telling. According to an FBI informant, Pipito had bragged that he was one of the men who kidnapped and killed Anthony Biernat back in 1963. "I was the first to hit Biernat," he allegedly said. "It was the first time in decades that a living man had tied himself to the crime." The irony didn't end there. The federal judge who arraigned Pipito was John Reynolds, the same man who, as governor of Wisconsin, had pleaded for FBI help in Biernat's disappearance 21 years earlier. This time, Reynolds wasn't asking for help. He was handing down orders. Pipito was convicted the following year on drug trafficking, conspiracy, and racketeering charges under the federal Kingpin statute. The sentence, 121 years in prison with a minimum of 30 to serve. He called it a fairy tale. But the judge had the last word. "You have a concern for other human beings that makes Idi Amin look like an altar boy." Pipito died in 2011, still insisting he'd been framed. No one was ever charged for Biernat's murder. But with Pipito's boast, the FBI finally had names to go with the ghosts. Decades have passed since Anthony Biernat's name filled the headlines, but his story still hangs over the Midwest like a cold wind off Lake Michigan. His death marked a turning point, a reminder that organized crime didn't just live in the big cities. It thrived in the quiet towns between them, where business owners tried to stay independent and sometimes paid with their lives. No one was ever charged for Biernat's murder. The witnesses who saw him dragged into that Ford sedan couldn't identify the men. The leads that tied the killing to the Milwaukee Mafia or the Chicago outfit were never strong enough to stand in court. Over the years, pieces of the truth surfaced: a dying confession, a mobster's boast, the whispers of FBI files, but no one ever stood trial. Anthony Biernat left behind a wife, a business, and 1,000 mourners who filled the church at his funeral. His Jukebox Empire was eventually dismantled, his roots taken over by others. But his story didn't fade. It became a case study in how the mob operated when it wanted control. Silent, methodical, and without mercy. Today, the farmhouse where his body was found is gone, the land reclaimed by weeds and weather. But in law enforcement circles, the name Biernat still carries weight, a symbol of how organized crime reached into small-town America and left behind a mystery that time couldn't bury.